Welcome to the Defining Moments podcast. I'm Rabbi David Fine, and we're here at the beautiful Dabru Studios in Modi'in, and I'm very happy, I'm very lucky to be able to host our very special guest today, Gila Tolub. Hi, Gila.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming, and I really want to talk about you and the critical work that you're doing. And but before we get to that, usually when I have a guest, I take 2 minutes to just give me a quick rundown of who you are, basic bio before we start our the formal interview. But I believe that your background is, everyone's background is connected to the work they do. But I think especially your background is very connected to the work that you're doing now and the organization that you started. So I want to dwell a bit on that. So why don't you just start by telling us, the basic bio?
Sure. So, look, I'm originally from France. I'll say that right away because your listeners will wonder about the accent if I don't put it out. So French, I then spent 12 years in the US, both New York and Chicago. And then I made Aliyah 8 years ago. So that's the, diaspora Jew journey back to Israel. But in terms of my work experience, I started as a consultant working in change management, training strategy, and then made my way to management consultant. I went to get an MBA at the University of Chicago. Then I joined McKinsey. That's a global firm doing consulting work.
Right, that's the biggest firm in consulting, right? McKinsey,
yeah,
yes.
Correct.
Right.
When I got there, it was important for me to do work that has meaning. So not only help the bottom line of an organization, but also be connected to something. I always say I had 2 children when I started, which gives me that luxury of knowing that your work has to also be meaningful and purposeful. And if you're going to spend so much time away from them. And so, public sector, education, social sector, I didn't know exactly what. And then I said, maybe healthcare. And, McKinsey said, yes, we have a lot of healthcare.
So when I think about McKinsey, or I know about McKinsey, but when other people hear the word McKinsey, I think they think about business and, like you said, the bottom line, making money. What does a consulting firm have to do with healthcare?
Yeah. So look, healthcare is also a lot of businesses. So we supported hospital systems that are trying to save money on the way they do supply management, let's say, or we had work that was to do with pharmacy chain and how do you source generic drugs from India or other countries. I did work that was more medical devices. How do you bring new med devices to market? But also in the beginning in 2015, actually, very quickly, I created with a few colleagues the McKinsey vaccines practice. So
this is in America.
Exactly when I was making Aliyah. Actually, it was in the summer of 2015. But the firm is really global. McKinsey is very global, so it doesn't matter where you're sitting. And we built a whole perspective on what happens if we stop investing in infectious diseases and vaccine, which is exactly what was happening in the world. And people thought it was crazy and niche. And
then COVID came.
And then COVID
right.
came. And suddenly you're super vindicated.
Right.
I'm on maternity leave with my 4th child at the time. And so at that time, first of all, I was in Israel, so a bit far from a lot of the manufacturers, but also very close to Geneva, where a lot of the global public health work is being done. So I started to work more on global public health and thinking about health equity. How do we make sure that everybody's ready for getting out of the COVID, implementing vaccination campaigns? And after I fell in love with this idea of health equity, and in the US, you also had at the same time in 2020 Black Lives Matters, and you had the FDA that stopped a clinical trial to make sure that it actually matched the population. Those are big changes. And so we created a McKinsey health equity practice. And 2 areas of modern medicine where we're very far from equity are women's health and mental health. Women's health because we have a medicine that's very organ by organ and women's health, by definition, because of the endocrinology system, is very systemic. And so there are a lot of things we don't know about the way women react to drugs, the way women, the symptoms, even in cardiovascular events, things like this. And mental health, because there is very little investment going into psychiatry. If you look at how many pharma companies are looking for drugs, it's very, very few. And the more we learn about the brain, the more we realize we don't know much about the brain. So I've been doing this kind of work for now since 2020.
Okay, great. So I want to get back to some of your background later, but before we get there, I think it's important to bring in a few other things. So we've known each other for a few months now, so I'm going to just assume some of the things that I know that you would tell me. You finished working for McKinsey. I think you retired from McKinsey, right, in the summer of 2023, correct?
That's right.
Right.
Yep.
Why did you retire?
What did I retire?
You seem pretty young to retire.
I wasn't retiring fully, I wish. But I felt like, when you feel like you no longer belong to an organization. Like it had been 12 years. First of all, it's a very long time in McKinsey years. Yes, some people end up going till retirement, but I felt like I had done what I wanted to do.
And you were a partner in McKinsey, right?
I was a partner,
right?
Yeah. I also felt like I didn't want to go back to traveling on 3 planes per week like before the COVID.
Right. Wow.
I feel like during COVID, I met so many amazing people in Israel, and I worked with a lot of startups, and I felt like going back to, quote unquote, the old economy and being on planes all week, it wasn't me anymore. And I felt, I'm going to leave and I'll know what I'll do after the Chagim.
Right. So after the Chagim, 2023, we all know what happened, still during the Chagim. So then, of course, October 7th happened, Simchat Torah, 2023, the war breaks out, and you immediately spring into action. So why don't you tell us what happened?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm going to say I didn't immediately spring into action. I was actually textbook in terms of acute stress response, where, really for 72 hours, I didn't know where I was, how I didn't come out of my pajamas. It's important for me to say that because I want to normalize the stress response that we are all in then and now and sometimes, and
But when I say immediately, I don't mean the next second.
No,
72 hours
just,
in my book is still immediate.
Yeah. But it's still important for me to, pause on this just to make sure we all realize that, it's funny because I just thought one of the hashtags that came out of Israel was, Israel tech no matter what. And it came out really early. And at the beginning, it was hard for me to read this because I felt like we're doing hashtag no matter what very quickly because we like to be these resilient people. But for a lot of people, it was very soon. It was not no matter what. We were still very deep into the trauma. And so what I did that week is, first of all, that first week, a lot of people from Chutz La'aretz, from outside of Israel, were asking, how do we help Israel? Like, where do we send our money or what, and it was hard to answer that question because the field is extremely fragmented in mental health. People were asking me about mental health. They know that's my field, right?
Were you involved in mental health before during your McKinsey work?
Yeah, since 2020.
Oh, since
yes.
2020.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. Right. So mental health, women's health, people knew it was my world, right? Also, McKinsey actually reached out to me. They said, we want to help the country. So can you join us as an external advisor, pro bono and help us? And of course, like what better way to use my time, and philanthropists also were trying to figure out the system and it's so fragmented and where, how do we help? So that first week I started thinking about, if those philanthropists want to help, what could they do with that money, how to think about it. There are no protocols for that trauma at scale, and the other thing that happened that first week is I actually got a call from a friend that a group of people that wanted to just do good and posted on Facebook and Instagram, if you were at the Nova Festival and you feel like being in a community with your friends, come to Bet Yitzchak. And they thought 40 people would show up and 400 showed up.
Bet Yitzchak is?
Bet Yitzchak is a yishuv or moshav, I don't know exactly the size, but it's it's not far from Herzliya and Shchaim. It's in Emek Hefer, and people showed up, but not 40, 400. And
wow!
They weren't ready for 400. And
these are all people who survived the Nova Festival.
Exactly. And I spoke with them on Friday, and they were so
Friday right after the war started.
Yeah, and they were so overwhelmed by the number of people, and I said, maybe I can help from an organizational point of view. Plus, I know trauma, so it will be easier. And they said, okay, come on Sunday. And on Sunday, we're moving to Chavad Ronit, which is a beautiful wedding hall.
Yeah, I've been there several times.
So Bet Yitzchak is like 10 minutes from there.
Right.
And so
just for our listeners, Chavad Ronit is one of the nicest wedding halls in all of Israel. In fact, I was there for a wedding in our community a few months ago, and I thought about you, and I just realized, wow, Like we're here celebrating a wedding and you were there doing very different stuff.
So I was there
Right.
2 weeks ago for a cousin's son's wedding. It was very hard
Right.
to be there. The emotions of
Right.
being back. And
So tell us what happened there.
So what happened there was, first of all, magical. The place became almost like a refuge, I would say, like a healing ground. Like people would just come to be together. There were a few things happening. You had agency, so we didn't force anyone to do anything. They could sit outside, or they can come to speaking circles, or they could talk one-on-one with volunteers that were mental health professionals specialized in trauma. Or they could get body work, meaning like a massage or acupuncture. And it's very important, actually, after a traumatic event, you disconnect very often from your body. So that was part of the treatment. Some people asked us, is it pinouk? Like, is this just like a bonus because they have been through something terrible? I said, no, it's actually part of reconnecting with your body.
And these professionals, either the people who were giving the massages or the mental health therapists, did you ask them to come or did they just show up? They knew?
Wow, they just came. It was incredible. We had, at some point, like one of the hardest things was actually, steering that ship. We had 900 volunteers of all kinds, right? 200 therapists.
Wow.
Which the therapists were the hardest one because we wanted to actually check their credentials. We can't let anyone come in. Also, not all therapists, I didn't know that, but not all therapists know trauma.
Right.
Some therapists are just, family or children or couples therapy. And we needed people who actually understand trauma. So we had 200 therapists that we needed to work in shifts. And we wanted them to have also supervision. So they used to come at the same time, finish at the same time,
Wow.
the next shift coming.
And how many survivors were there at that time?
So by the time when I joined on the Sunday, that day we had 700. On Monday, we had 900, and we had to close the doors. It was a traumatic day because...
How many people survived Nova altogether?
3,700.
Oh, wow.
And we didn't even have it was the beginning of the war. We were not allowed to have more than, I think, 300 people in the room.
Right, because of Home Front Command rules. We weren't allowed to gather more than 300 or 400 people.
And remember,
right?
we still had a zakot.
Right.
So we had red alerts and people we actually had one with all the survivors where we all had to go, and you had half of them who were shaking like leaves and half of them were like, I survived the Nova. I'm not going to go to the Mamad because
of a red alert.
Because of a red alert.
Right.
So it was also this ongoing stress that I think is also important to mention, because even now in Israel, after we are in ongoing stress, a lot of people think Israel is a country in post-trauma, and it's not. It's a country that's still in the traumatic event, right? It's happening.
Right. So, post-trauma is post, right? But we're very much still in it.
Some people are already in post-trauma. We could talk about what that is. But in any way, so their survivors found each other and found a community. They felt like it was the only place where they could be themselves. Even some went as far as saying, it's the only place where I can smile. Because when I'm outside, I feel guilty about smiling.
Because I survived.
Because I survived.
Right.
And people are looking at me like this nebach, poor kid, right? But here, we're all in the same boat. So I can laugh, I can cry, I can... And
you were directing this entire thing?
On the org side, yeah. So managing the shifts of the volunteers, I only started to talk about the therapists, but we had volunteers who were bringing back and forth, volunteers who were bringing food. We had logistics volunteer who had a clean up and re-up every morning, every night. We had all of the massage therapy, all the holistic care, I would say, that also had their own shifts. It was really like a huge organization, right? Imagine 900 volunteers, and then every day, more than when we got to steady state, 400 people coming in and out every day.
Wow.
Big org.
So at some point during this time, I assume that's the moment when you at least thought of starting what you started, ICAR, which is ICAR, Israel's Collective Action for Resilience, the ICAR Collective, which we're going to spend some time talking about now. But when was it? What moment was it that you decided that this was necessary?
It was the first week of the war, before then. So it was on the Wednesday of the first week of the war. And my son was making challah. He didn't want to wait till the dough rises. So I finished, and then I told him I'll finish. So I made them, and I told my husband, we're letting the trauma manage us instead of us managing the trauma, right? Because I'm making challah, which I should not be doing. not the best. And there are other things that I know how to do, right? And I think all of us were trying to find meaning and try to find ways to be helpful, but we were really letting trauma manage us, right? And I felt like, how do we actually take control of this thing? And in a way, it came also from all the questions about where should we send money? And I was thinking, what if instead of just pouring money left and right, we thought almost like a VC fund. Like a VC fund looks at the market.
Venture capital.
Yeah.
Right.
And it says...
No, just saying for people who may not know that.
Of course, yeah. It says, the market is growing at, 2 to 3%. But there are pockets of growth, and that's what we look for. We look for the pockets of growth. We look for the innovation, and we want to put the money where we have 8%.
Right.
So how do we accelerate trauma healing? We could peanut butter spread money across all of the amutot and all of the clinics and all of the hospitals. Or we can think about what are those things that actually can disproportionately accelerate healing. And a lot of it is actually not treatment. It's actually prevention. It's community work, community resilience. And how do we do this mapping of everything that's happening from prevention to treatment to rehabilitation at the national level, at the community level, and at the individual level?
Okay, so I want to talk about all that, but just two quick questions based on what you just said. Number one, so when somebody called you the second, third day of the war and said, where should we send the check? What did you say?
I said, I don't know. I said, I don't know. I said, you could either send it to the very large organizations that everybody knows.
Right.
Like the Natal, Iran, Enosh, very good organizations, right? Where you can't go wrong. Right. Or I advise you to talk to the actual communities themselves about what they need. So, for example, with one of the donors in France, they already had a relationship with the Kerem Shalom.
Right.
And that's what they decided to do, like to go and help Kerem Shalom, And so it depends on the...
Now, you also just said the trauma was managing us instead of us managing the trauma. Okay, so I could understand, an inability to... I can't understand an ability to manage such mass trauma 48 hours, 72 hours after the start of something so massive. So the fact that you were already thinking in those terms right after the war began, where did that come from?
I think a lot from my training, right? From my training as a consultant, and but also because I had those basics on trauma. So from the work of mental health that I did, funny or beshert, however. But I had been studying a lot collective trauma with Thomas Hubel, who's in Tel Aviv and is one of the leaders in thinking about collective trauma. We used some of his wisdom also when we looked at trauma within organizations. Imagine a pharma company that has a drug that killed people. That trauma lives in the organization. They build defense mechanisms. So I had been studying these topics for a while. I had already read all the classic of Bessel van der Kolk and Gabor Mate and It Doesn't Start With You. And all of this was already, somehow in my conscious.
You almost sound like some kind of prophet.
No, it's not. I think mental health, and I say to a lot of people, the mental health crisis did not happen on October 7th. The mental health crisis existed before October 7th, but it was exposed on October 7th, right?
Right.
And we saw it during COVID. COVID was a big, and if you look at the pharma startup, the mental health startups, the VC world went crazy investing in mental health startups in 2020, 2021.
Now, as a rabbi and somebody who works in training rabbis for many years now, I certainly agree with you that this crisis started way before October 7th.
Exactly.
And like you said, was only exposed. Maybe the numbers are much bigger, but the issues have been going on for decades. So,
exactly.
So tell us a little bit about ICAR, meaning you said it was the idea was born even before you went to Chavat Ronit to be with the survivors. So what is it? What is your aim? What are you looking to accomplish?
Yeah, so it's a bit in the name, right? The collective action for resilience. So the idea is that every organization today that's touching trauma healing, mental health, has its own goal, mission statement, population, right? You're working with rabbis and you want to promote community rabbis, etc. But I think after October 7th, every organization also has this overarching or another goal that is, let's accelerate healing from
For
October
sure.
7 and recovery.
For sure.
And suddenly all of us.
And not just, I'll just interrupt you, not just within our own, Dalit Amot, not just within our close circles, but I know that we started trying to do things that we would have never imagined, trying to do things naturally to do what you're saying, accelerate healing.
Exactly.
Right.
And so suddenly we're all moved by a common goal. And when you have a common goal that you can all stand behind, there's potential for collective impact. There's potential for 1 + 1 = 3.
Right.
Now, it means that we need to start thinking, first of all, realize that none of us can do this alone almost, right? I think it becomes clear that partnerships are key, right? Maybe you have engaged in so many more partnerships, I think you mentioned.
That's barur what you're saying.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't succeed in anything without partnerships.
Exactly.
Right?
But
Right.
I think a lot of organizations, when they're very focused on their work and their numbers, and even nonprofits have to report to their donors, right? And they're so busy working day and night that they don't always know who else is doing the work. They don't always know how do I partner with and who do I partner with even, right? So what the idea of ICAR is that now that we all understand that none of us can do this alone, and also that there's enough patients for everybody, and that we are all united by this goal of accelerating healing. So how do we work together?
Right.
And the idea is that usually you need a backbone organization to do this. So we're
So you're that
building,
backbone. You're trying to be that
We're
backbone
trying to
organization.
be that backbone.
Right. So what does that mean, a backbone organization here?
Yeah. So in that case, it's about building transparency. So who's doing what, just at the most basic level, which is already helpful in understanding where are the gaps, where are the duplication. Second level is how do we actually convene and engage those folks so that we know each other, we can learn from each other, we can share what we're seeing, and maybe identify trends before it turns into something bigger.
So you're talking about just the nonprofit world now?
So we're looking at nonprofit because it was the hardest one. It's extremely fragmented. There are more than 300 nonprofits in the field.
Wow.
Yeah.
There are more than 300 nonprofit organizations in Israel dealing with trauma and mental health.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And then you have, 8 government hospitals, 4 kupot cholim, and
right. The kupot cholim are the HMOs. Right?
Exactly.
Right.
And then you have, and they each have like clinics, and then you have the hospitals that are independent, like the Hadassah, Shaare Tzedek, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just, really hard to know who's doing what.
Right. No one knows what the other, the one hand doesn't know what the other is doing.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Mm-hmm. Even within the Ministry of Defense, we've introduced people from different departments that didn't know that they were working on something that could benefit one another.
Right, wow.
Right?
Well, the government, that doesn't surprise me. But in the nonprofit world, you would hope that it was just a little bit better. But even in the nonprofit world, you're saying that there's been no convening of all these organizations, right?
And so there's been some convening at some levels, like the Trauma Coalition, the ITC. There's been some of the large ones, like Natal, played a role at the beginning of the war, bringing together the Nova. So we need to give credit where credit's due. There's been some work, but what we're trying to do is to say we're never gonna deal with patients. Right?
Directly.
We're not directly. We're not.
You're not offering services or therapeutic services.
Exactly.
Right.
So we don't want to compete with the field.
Right.
What we want is to help the field.
Right.
And so in business words, it would be B2B instead of B2C. We're like a B2B. And we are introducing NGOs to NGOs. We're introducing NGOs to academia when they want to be able to research what they're doing.
I should just say I'm a beneficiary of this, my own organization. I got a call from Lisa Silverman, your colleague, last week or the week before. We've met a number of times over the past few months, and she called to introduce me to a colleague in another mental health organization in Israel that she thought that we could learn from each other and help each other. So yeah, I mean, it was very helpful.
So we do these connections like really on a daily basis, and it's incredible. And then and we see, sometimes it leads to one conversation, sometimes it's more, sometimes it leads to a partnership. Who knows, right? We also help connect philanthropists to NGOs. So obviously that also is interesting. But I would say we see it as important because the field is so fragmented and the topic is so complicated that we find many philanthropists are afraid almost of the field, right? It's like...
These are philanthropists in the United States or in Israel?
Both.
Both. Uh-huh.
So first of all, like funding mental health has never been the most sexy thing to do.
Right.
I mean, if you go to a hospital, the buildings, cardiovascular has somebody's name on it.
Right.
Cancer has somebody's name
The
on it.
psychiatric ward does not.
No,
Right.
not often, right? And I give a lot of credit to Dana Azrieli, who has put her name on the building now in Hebrew, right, for mental health and addiction. And I think we're seeing also some of this destigmatization.
Well, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. We'll get back to what you're saying. Because as you said that about Dana Azrieli, I said, if there's any silver lining here, maybe it's that the stigma problem is finally being addressed in a serious way where it hasn't been before. We've been working on stigma, destigmatization in our rabbinic community, in our communities for years. And it's worse in Israel than it is in the United States. But maybe that's some kind of silver lining. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe.
Right.
And it's funny because I was talking to someone a few weeks ago, and they said, actually, PTSD is like the less stigmatized part of mental health.
Right.
Because in a sense, saying I'm a soldier and I have PTSD is like, yeah, Baruch. Right. You went through so much, right? I was at the Nova, I have PTSD, of course, right? It's like not... so PTSD in a sense is the least stigmatized, and now we have this going for us. But I also will take this opportunity to say that trauma doesn't lead only to PTSD. It leads to eating disorders. It leads to depression, anxiety. I was talking to the CEO of the Cohen Veterans Network, which is a clinic for veterans in the U.S. They have more than 25 clinics all around the U.S. And they have 9 years of data, 70,000 patients. And he says, in the end, only 15% are there for PTSD. A lot of them are there for anxiety, depression, marital issues, right? A lot of people are worried now about divorce. Miluimnikim who come back from reserve after months and months disconnected from their wives and the kids, right? So there are a lot of things that are happening that we need to think about beyond PTSD.
Right. So we're going to talk about trauma and PTSD, but we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. I want to go back to the convening and the mapping and all that. You've used the word mapping. I've heard you say that many, many times. So I think it seems to me that was your first goal, just to understand what everyone. So have you completed that process, or?
I don't think we'll ever complete that process, but we've identified, those 330 that I mentioned.
Right.
We've mapped in more details 230, and we spoke to actually like almost 150.
Wow.
Between 120 and 150. And that was important just to get started and build trust with people, also to help them understand who we are, what we're doing, etc. The next step is to actually understand from these organizations what are their projects, where do they need support. Through those interviews, we also captured a lot of this, right? But now we're going to the next step, which is a little deeper, which is, as you know, looking at projects in NGOs, so different. We're also continuing with mapping research. So there's a lot of research happening, and nobody knows who's doing what research, and even within universities, sometimes the Department of Psychology doesn't know if the Department of Social Work is doing research, right? So we're starting this on a pilot with Metiv and Natal, and then we'll see how we can help grow it and help use the mapping as a way to develop a national agenda for research. So that's the mapping, the transparency. The second one I mentioned was just the matchmaking, the convening, the roundtables, etc. And the third one is, instead of bottom-up mapping, is top-down. So going to the experts and asking them, if you had $100 million, where would you put it? And then
$100 million, that's not a lot of money these days, right?
So some of them had right away like an answer.
Right.
I think this is what we should do. Some of them, didn't know. They said, I would probably do a portfolio of activities, but measure success, because collective trauma, again, is a really, really recent field. Like we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what works it doesn't always work for everybody. There's no one size fits all. And some, anyways, with all of these interviews, we got to 8 impact areas where people agreed that if you do those 8 things, you can disproportionately accelerate trauma healing. And
okay, so tell us what they are, or at least a few of them.
Yeah,
maybe not all 8 because we don't have enough time, but you could go to
tell you about the ones we prioritize.
What's your website? I can see the rest.
ICARcollective.org.
ICARcollective.org.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
So I was at your summit a few months ago, actually, now, and I heard about these, but they're very exciting. So why don't you tell us? Yeah.
So look, one, for example, is psychoeducation. And this is one where I feel like everyone has a small budget for psychoeducation. Psychoeducation means telling people what's happening now to their psyche because of the situation we're in. So I'll give you an example. Like we have a survivor from De Nova who comes and he says, I'm here because I don't want PTSD. I have friends from the army who have PTSD. I know it's awful. And we asked him, like, who did you come with? It was on the Sunday after the war started, a week after. So he says, I'm here with my parents, my family. So you could see he's well surrounded. And we tell him one statistics. Do you know that 80% of people who go through a traumatic event end up not having PTSD? And his entire body changes, his shoulders, relax. And he's like, no, behemet, really? And we said, yes. And then, he says, so can I go to Thailand tomorrow? I have a plane ticket. So I love this because it's so Israeli.
So
right?
you're saying that somebody who experiences traumatic experience almost expects or thinks that they should have PTSD.
Exactly.
And that's not necessarily true.
He was almost like he condemned himself. He thought he was sick.
Right.
And then suddenly we tell him, the most
that you're
people,
okay.
You're okay.
Right.
Like, it's okay to be okay.
Right.
And suddenly he takes this as permission to function, right? Because his next question is, can I then continue with my life?
Right.
Really. And a lot of time right now, people need to hear that it's okay to go on with their lives. And some of the things that the psychiatrists I work with tell me is like, we need to push the families to push people, away from the couch, not treat them like, oh my God, you just came back.
Right.
No, now it's go back to work. We know it's hard, but push them to function. Functioning is the best measure for getting back to life. And by the way, we know that those who don't go back to work within 6 months, within a year, might never go back to work, right?
Wow. So that's psychoeducation.
So that's psychoeducation. And the messages are not the same for everyone, which is what makes it hard, right? Some people need to hear it's okay to be okay. Right. Some people need to hear it's okay not to be okay, right? So, for example, people who say, oh my God, I cry every day. Like I almost cried every day, right? Because it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation.
Well, certainly at the beginning, we were all crying every day.
Exactly.
Right.
And really like it's so abnormal what we're living right now. There was this joke at the beginning last week, like we are canceling April Fool because no prank can be close to reality, right? To how crazy reality is. And so it's really now to say to people, it's okay. Like actually you're having a very normal reaction.
It's normal.
Exactly. Right. And so it's a lot about le normel, to normalize. I love this word in Hebrew.
Right. So it's sort of just to educate in mass amounts the ways that people are feeling or should be feeling or can be feeling.
Like everybody talks now about flight, fight, and freeze, right? It's actually understanding what that means. So when you're in trauma, your body, by definition, wants to protect you. Your biology is really strong. So I'll give you a real example. A girl from De Nova comes out paralyzed from the waist down, okay? Doctor tells her, we did CAT scan, MRI, you're fine. It's all in your head. First of all, like a little bit negative, but okay, move on. Everybody's having a hard time.
Wait, did anything physically happen to her?
Nothing physically happened to her. What happened is she played dead for hours and hours. And her brain is extremely smart. Actually, trauma response is an intelligent response. And that's one thing I want everybody to know. For example, that's psychoeducation. Trauma response is an intelligent response. Her body said, you want to play dead? You need to play dead to survive. I'll help you, right? Now, what happens is after a traumatic event, you want to go back to normal because you don't need to be in this situation, but we're in an ongoing stress, there's still a zakot outside. And so she's not letting go of this protection mechanism and just telling her,
it's all in your head.
It's not all in your head. I mean, yes, it is in your head, but it's because your brain is so smart. It's protecting you, right? So this flight, fight, freeze response is here to protect us, right? And we need to respect it. And, sometimes we call it the amygdala hijack. And today we don't have big monsters coming to eat us, although it feels like it right now. And sometimes it's just ego that is being hurt, but we are triggered, right?
So what happened to that girl?
So that girl couldn't talk because of disassociation. One of the ways that trauma expresses itself is disassociation. But we worked only on her body. So acupuncture, massage, etc. And she felt a tingle in her leg after a few days. And that's when she broke apart, was able to speak, and then was able to let go of this defense mechanism. But a lot of us carry those defense mechanisms. And it's about recognizing what they are, why they're there, and then being kind to yourself and saying, I needed those at a certain point in my life, but maybe I don't need them anymore. And so this is all psychoeducation, right?
Tell us about one or two more, yeah.
Another one is public health surveillance. So
Public health surveillance.
Surveillance, right? I know it sounds very big brother, but it's a public health intervention. During COVID, we all saw every day the numbers of, mild cases, severe cases, how many people are in the hospital. We could even tell, Pikuda Oref, the
Home Front Command.
They were asking us, are you sneezing? Do you have low-grade fever? I don't know if you remember, we had those.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
And then why were they doing that? Because if we start to sneeze right now, it means that more and more people are starting to sneeze. We can predict that in 2 weeks from now, there's an outbreak in Modine.
Right.
That's something that's known in infectious disease. That's also something the WHO does during wars and crisis about basic hygiene monitoring, children's health, maternal health. Just the fact that you monitor allows you to get in front of the trends and intervene in some sense. So in COVID, it was like, now we're going to ask people in Modine to stay home, to bend the curve, to make sure we don't have a huge outbreak.
Right. So you're saying you could do the same in mental health.
We're saying Israel is well positioned to do this in mental health. It's never been done before. The expert from the WHO, Dr. Dorit Nitzan, came back to Israel in the summer of 2023 after 9 years. She wanted to be here. There are a lot of great people that are studying public health that could do it. And we're saying, Israel is well positioned to start it, try it. How are we doing as a nation? How do we track how we're doing as a nation? What metrics are the right metrics? By the way,
so I don't understand. I just want to push you a little because it sounds very nice, but I understand in COVID, if somebody sneezes, that the next person will sneeze and there'll be an outbreak. But just because you know that somebody in, wherever, Modine has PTSD, how does that
So we wouldn't track PTSD.
Right.
What would we track? We would track how many people are no longer showing up to work. How many kids are no longer, because right now we have anecdotal evidence that 30% of teenagers in the North and the South gave up on school. Right? Because how do you go back to school after what they've been through? Let's be honest, right? We have anecdotal evidence that the head of the Ministry of Education in the North, there's something called you'll help me with the English, אירועים חריגים, difficult events.
Out of the norm events, yeah.
So some of the things that happen in schools have to be raised to the
next level,
municipality, and then to the level, to the region or whatever. She says they used to have 2 per week, and they're now at about 6 or 8 per day.
Wow.
Right? So these
are reportable events that need to be reported to the next level up and to the next level up.
Exactly.
Right.
So as long as we're just talking like this, it's called anecdotal evidence. Right? And I can't really convince you to do something. Or to change the way. But if we manage to capture this on a weekly basis, even on a monthly basis, let's say, right? Then we have real data in front of our eyes that together paints a picture of should we be worried or not at this point.
So this is research-based evidence that can help, whereas the anecdotal evidence may help here or there, but doesn't really show or demonstrate anything conclusively.
Exactly. And so here, then you would be like, and then there are some things that we could. So, for example, if we have more, let's say we convince some of the nonprofit organization working on eating disorders or whatever to tell us how many calls do they have every week, right? And then we see we have more and more calls on eating disorders. Then suddenly we know, let's do an intervention, which is to train the teachers, train the teenagers, train the parents, train the rabbis.
Right.
So what are those triggers? And so we can go back to think. And so there's 2 schools of thoughts. There's a school of thought that said just the fact that we know how the population is doing is already an intervention in itself.
Right.
And then there's a school of thought that says we should only track metrics that give us a very direct action.
Cause and effect.
Cause and effect. If this goes up, then we should do this. So there's both. But then that's one where, again, no one can do this alone because the data is scattered around.
All over the place, right. So we don't have so much time left. We have a little time left, but not so much time. So I want to do 2 things. The last thing I want to do is talk about my own involvement through my organization, Barkai, and the rabbis. But before that, I'd like to just have you, not that you yourself are a mental health professional, but you actually know a lot more than a lot of mental health, or at least some mental health professionals that I know. I think there's a lot of confusion and about what is trauma and what is post-trauma, PTSD?
Yeah.
Because I think that in terms of coming to some resolution or trying to have some kind of effective, that people have to understand what those things are in order to help. Yeah.
Amazing. And that's the beginning of psychoeducation.
Right. So trauma, what is trauma?
Trauma is an event
Right.
that either puts you in front of death or perceived, death. It could be direct or indirect. So it could be you or your loved ones. And now we also know that it could be not one event, but multiple small events. So chronic stress or like abused children, right? So abused children, it's multiple events, and then it becomes like trauma, childhood trauma is multiple adverse events in childhood events. So
trauma sounds like, I know what it is. I'm just trauma is an event. It's an experience. It's not some kind of sickness or
no,
Okay.
Exactly.
So anyone who was in Israel on October 7th experienced some kind of trauma, correct?
Some kind, exactly.
Right.
But some
no,
more
somebody
acute,
who was at Nova was much more acute than, right.
Exactly.
Right.
That's exactly how you think about it. And we don't know what influences the reaction you'll have to the trauma. You could take two twins with the exact same DNA, and one may be totally fine, and the other one might react very
and have
badly.
the same experience.
The same experience, and
right.
then not react the same. So we don't really know. Like, there's a lot of research on what makes people more resilient, less resilient. We know like what could help with resilience, but we don't really know what innate, if there's anything innate about it. Now, after an event, a traumatic event, you have what I called before, like the acute stress response, which was thought to be, 72 hours. That's when you're like in shock, right? People are sitting, but it could be multiple ways. Like, not everybody expresses shock the same way, right? Some people may be talking a lot, but they're disassociated from their emotions, right? They're talking from the head, not from the heart, right? Some people may completely be silent and not talking, right? And then there's something called acute stress disorder. Is when you're no longer in the acute stress response, you're in the acute stress disorder. And it used to be that we thought that this lasts 4 weeks and that's it. If it's more than 4 weeks, you need to be worried about PTSD, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what we know is that because the stress we're living, for example, in the war is a very long stress, there is no limit to this acute stress disorder. It could be 4 weeks, but it could be right now in chronic stress situation. We can be there for months and years. And so what does that look like? It means you have symptoms of PTSD, which overlap with a lot of psychiatric disorders, right? So, I don't know, like eating too much, eating too little, insomnia, or sleeping too much, sleeping too little, whatever, stress reactions, right? You know what stress, you experience stress, people experience different kind of stress. Now, what happens is for some people, these become extreme, those stress reactions. So PTSD is actually a mental health diagnosis. Some people will not experience PTSD, but will go into other things like eating disorder, depression, anxiety, etc. PTSD itself has 4 main symptoms, family of symptoms that we look at. One is just hypervigilance and always looking, or like a mother who wakes up at the slightest sound during the night because she's worried. You have some people that it's more avoidance, so they don't want to talk about it, more disassociation. You have, trying to think about all of them, but you have folks that have low mood and more anxiety, and that's really more about the sadness that comes back from things. And then the one that's very frequent and we talk the most about is intrusion. And why I wanted to end with this one, because intrusion is the one where you feel like you're reliving the event. Right, so a lot of reliving. Right. Yeah. So it's almost like you when you have a bullet wound, right, and then over time it becomes scarred, and you have a big scar, et cetera. Here, the wound starts bleeding over and over again when you relive it, either during nightmares or even flashbacks, right? And when you look at a CAT scan, actually, of a CT scan of somebody going through a flashback. It's not the memory part of their brain that lights up. It's the exact same parts of the brain that lit up
when it happened. Right. Wow.
They're reliving the experience. And so what you try to do during trauma therapy is to transform these experiences into memories and help people So right now, why am I saying this? Because right now, a lot of us are in acute stress, not in PTSD. A lot of us will the symptoms will go away on itself. There was a research that suggested 60% of the people not directly exposed on October 7th have symptoms of PTSD, which is symptoms of stress. But many of us will be fine. It's not we're not condemned, right? And we're strong and we're resilient. So it's an important thing to remember.
Now I want to get to, the communal aspect of this, because I heard you in a different forum. You were asked, about how one can help, what could be the best antidote to PTSD. And if I look on the NIH website or all these other websites, they'll tell me talk therapy and medication and all that. And the first thing you said in response to that question was you spoke about the fact that the Israeli veterans, right, coming back from war, do much better than the American veterans who came back after Vietnam or whatever. And you attributed that, or it is attributed in the literature, to community and to being hugged by community. So
that's right.
That said a lot to me, because I spend, 24/7 dealing with this issue of developing community in Israel. So talk to me more about that.
So for sure, there are other things, right? Especially the fact that everybody serves, the fact that the war is right here, and we are grateful to our soldiers, right? In the U.S., when people go fight a war super far, they even forget why we're fighting, right? But the community is super important, and we see this in many aspects of mental health support, right? So the communities that have strong ties surround each other during these times that are difficult times. Even you could see a community after someone lost their somebody is sitting Shiva. You see some communities where the person is alone most of the day, and you see some communities where the person is never ever alone, right? And there's something really important about that in healing. Actually, I'll say, even McKinsey, who's not the most spiritual institution, defines health as physical health, the body, mental health, the brain, but also social health, the heart, am I connecting with folks, and spiritual health, the soul. How do I have meaning and purpose in my life, right? And all of this says, how healthy we can be as a society.
So I'll just be totally open. You and I spoke a few weeks ago about getting some advice from you in terms of fundraising assistance, and from some of these foundations and philanthropists that you're dealing with. But I go to America. I was there 3-4 weeks ago, and I speak about the fact that we're rabbis and we're helping in terms of this whole effort in terms of mental health of PTSD, and they say to me, rabbis, what do you have to do? You're not mental health workers. So I tried to discuss this whole idea of community resilience, of the importance of spiritual leadership, the importance of trained spiritual leadership. So talk to me about whether that's important and, why it's important.
So I do think the rabbi has a big role, especially in religious, communities, in building that community aspect, right?
I'm not even talking about rabbis yet. We'll get to that, but I'm just talking about communities.
Communities, we could see. Look, when we look now in the South right now, what happened, you could see that some of the kibbutzim who had strong community ties are doing better. And by the way, Israel was very careful to keep them together, even when they were
in the hotels.
Right. Because they understood the importance of that community.
Staying together.
Exactly. And then you have some ishuvim, moshavim that sometimes don't even have a mayor, right? Because they're in a region and there isn't a natural way to connect. And it's much harder for them because they don't have one another in a natural, organic, you have to build the community now as we're trying to heal, right? I think we, when we look at even Harvard, I'm sure you've heard of that study. Harvard did a study where they followed people for 30 years, 40 years, and then they looked at who was the healthiest at the end of their lives. And it was all about the relationships that people had and the friendships that people had. So we know that community is a very, very important role to play in health in general. Now,
go on.
No, go for it.
No, so this term community resilience that you used, I've heard all over the place. What does it mean?
Yeah.
And why is it important?
Yeah. So I think it's the connective tissue that is bringing folks together. It's this point of not being alone ever with your challenges. It is the collective narrative. So it's interesting, right? So personal trauma is very lonely, because personal trauma, you feel like no one can understand what you've been through. And then now we have this collective trauma, which in a way we know less about, because I said, like, we don't have a lot of evidence on what to do. But the collective healing feels so much
feels
less
better
lonely,
than personal
right?
trauma.
Exactly.
Not
It
better,
feels
but less
but
lonely, right?
less lonely. It feels
Right.
like we're all in this together, right? And the more we do things together, the more we see each other. I think I was talking to Professor Frank Oberkleid from Australia, and he talks a lot about taking the expert out of the expertise, which is interesting. I love this expression, but he's saying, like, mental health is not a expert based. It shouldn't be expert based. Like, you have mental health professionals, but it's the teachers, it's the friends, right? We should be looking at peer-to-peer support. We should be teaching people how to do active listening and actually listen to people when they say, how are you, right? And
I always say that the very basis of all practical rabbinic education is listening, active
Exactly.
listening. That's what we spend much of our time in Barkai doing.
Exactly.
Right.
And people don't know how to do it.
Right.
Active listening is hard.
You sound like what you're talking about really is almost what they call preventative medicine,
Of course.
right? Let's not wait until the problem happens. Let's try and create the conditions so that the problem won't happen if we prepare for it.
No, I think one of the things that I'm trying to also highlight, and not just me, like with the experts on my board, et cetera, is we have a Professor Charles Marmor from NYU on our board, and he talks a lot about this, about how do we think about this like a chronic health issue, right? Actually, Wellcome Trust Foundation, that's a global public health organization, has declared mental health a public health issue. Because when you do diabetes prevention, it's you have people that are healthy and we need to keep them healthy and explain to them all the time, they still need to walk, they still need to eat fruits, et cetera. And we start from a young age, et cetera. And then you have people who already have prediabetes, or they're obese, or they're sedentary, and we need to do a bit more, right? And then you have people that are, and so same with mental health. We have people that are healthy and we need to keep them healthy. So how do you do this? So through healthy communities, through, I think a lot of Judaism, actually, like, and spiritual practices, if some people have other spiritual practices, are about this, right? Even praying 3 times a day is about mindfulness in my mind, right? Or being together for the Shiva and having visits, right, is about, really, I think a lot of the things that we do in Judaism are actually anchored in a lot of wisdom in terms of mental health and well-being. And it is about community.
So like we said at the beginning, that these problems didn't start on October 7th. They were just, revealed a little bit more on October 7th. These issues that we're talking about, especially the communal, the listening and the being together, we've been dealing with this for decades. And only now, talk about silver lining, at least for my organization, is that some of this is now people are seeing the importance of it where they weren't necessarily seeing it before. So we only have a few minutes left. I want to end with 2 questions, or I want to give you the opportunity to say anything that you feel like that needs to be said. But you said before that you asked a bunch of experts, like if they had $100 million, what would they do for it? What would they do with it? So I consider you an expert now. What would you do if I wrote you a check right now for $100 million? What do you think is the most important thing to do?
So the two that we're starting are out of the 8, we started with psychoeducation and with surveillance, which is very important. I think the third one that I believe in is our workforce capacity, and a bit what we were just talking about. So I don't believe that it's enough to train more psychiatrists or more psychologists. I don't think we can't catch up anyways fast enough. So there are people who say it's going to be about technology, and I believe there's might be some technology, but I also think there's something about stratified care and then the non-clinical supporters, right? So the peer-to-peer, if we could be better at that, the non-clinical emotional caregiver, right? The person who knows mindfulness and can help others, right? So all of this, I think, needs more research and policy shaping. So I'm not advocating for any solution because I don't think we've figured it out. But I really think we need to spend more time understanding. It's something that Israel is doing. And then the next step of psychoeducation for me is a trauma-informed society. So what do I mean by that? I mean, when you're a rabbi or you're a teacher and you see...
Madrich and Bnei Akiva.
Exactly. Right. And you see a kid, really not behaving. And instead of, our natural reaction is what's wrong with you.
Right.
Right. And the question is what's happened to you? What's happening to you? And I think a lot of very good rabbis know this. Like when they see a kid, not coming to shul anymore, not coming to shir anymore, the bad ones are probably screaming at them. The good ones are like, hey, what's up?
Right.
What's happening to you? And so this shift from what's wrong with you to what's happening to you could be a shift that we do as a society,
right,
with more psychoeducation. And imagine how different world would be if instead of asking everyone what's wrong with you, we would say what happened to you and started a dialogue about it, right?
Right. What's the plan, long-term plan for ICAR? 5 years, 10 years?
Look,
I'm setting you up for this because I know the answer. So I just want...
No. And some people will think it's a naive answer, but we really don't want to be in business in 5 to 10 years. What we hope is that the programs that we start will move into the government agencies that should own them.
Right. So that's why this was a setup, because I've heard you say this now 3 or 4 times, including to a Knesset member that we met with recently. Yep. And I haven't been able to understand this because all we've been talking about for months and months and months is how the government messed up. They didn't prepare properly. They didn't, so now you're going to create something and turn it over to the government that doesn't know what they're doing?
So first of all, I do believe that the next government can be better than the last one. I think one of the things that came out from this war is a lot of people who are not interested in working for the government, right? You would say, you pay me, I will never work for the government, right? Well, they don't pay, first of all. But a lot of young people between 35 and 40 understand now why they need to take a bigger, that it's our responsibility. There isn't the government and us, right? It's us. It's us. By the way, I've been working with a lot of people from the government in the last year and a half. There are amazing people also there. We have great partners, people who really want to make a difference. Right. And so it's about finding those people and upskilling others, but also bringing more professionals to the government. So meaning like mixing it a bit, right? Right now, it's very hard to move from the private sector to the public sector. And so how do we create those bridges? And I think that is in a lot of people I'm speaking with right now, including John Polin that I met last week. Like a lot of people decided that that's one of the big things they want to do is think about leadership.
Public service.
Bridging to public service, not necessarily them doing the public service, but how do we bring some of the knowledge we have in other areas and bring it to the public service? And I think there's a lot to be said about building the next generation of leaders. So, look, I don't know what it's going to look like, but I do think that there needs to be a government office that's responsible for thinking about trauma. I'm not a huge fan of the U.S. health system, far from it. But after the opioids crisis, at the federal level, the government created a plan, and now there's a phone number called 988, like 911 for mental health. I think there are ways that we can centralize and do things effectively. And cutting across Minister of Education, Minister of Health, Minister of Welfare, looking at this as a systemic issue, which it is.
So to close, I'll ask a 2-part question. Number one, you're not just looking to start you said 330 organizations. So you're not just looking to start the 331st organization, not to downplay the importance because they all do very important work, but you're looking to overhaul the entire way mental health is provided in the state of Israel. I mean, that's a pretty tall order. So, you're dreaming big here. So where does that come from?
I don't know. It's a system. I don't know. I feel like in my mind, things are very systemic. I don't see a way to fix one thing and it's going to fix everything, right? Like every time I think about fixing one thing, so let me give a concrete example. Like I was talking to someone, she said, well, why don't you focus on resilience, right? The community resilience part that we were talking about. Right. And I said, yeah, but But I know that in hospitals, in psychiatric hospitals in Israel, if you compare our occupancy rates to other countries, think we're all insane because our occupancy rates are so high. Now, if you look into it, you actually realize that a third of the people in psychiatric hospitals are actually there almost like babysitting. We don't want people homeless. And if someone can't be taken care of by their family, then they end up in a psychiatric hospital, right? My daughter was doing Shirut Leumi in a psychiatric hospital. She would take them to doctor appointments. Like, they were not dangerous people. They didn't really need, they were people who couldn't be alone at home and didn't have it. So we know that if we had better long-term care facilities for people, that would be much cheaper, right? It would free up budget to do other things, right? And so it's a system. I can't look at the clinical pathway and not say, yeah, but we need to free up the beds and then free up the budget because having a full bed is expensive. Also, if I don't free up those beds, women are being discharged much faster than men because they're not violent. So the men are kept, the women are sent home because they're only depressive and suicidal, but not violent to others. So it's easier. Like, there are just too many problems that are connected. And it's like a chess game. And I'm like, if we only do this, it won't work. If we only do this, it won't work.
So you're answering my question like an organizational consultant.
Yes.
And that's not how I want you to answer.
Oh.
I want you to answer, okay, many people think in terms of systems and what you just described, but what is your inspiration? I want, it's like, it's catchy. I'm like, I feel very inspired just by sitting here and listening to you. Who's your inspiration? Where does it all come from?
Look, my dad has been in the public sector for my whole life.
Uh-huh.
So I'm a granddaughter of a rabbi. He decided not to go the rabbi route, but to go the nonprofit route.
Uh-huh.
So helping the Jewish, the Jewish community in France. And then to me, trauma has impacted me at different parts in my life. So the first time when my mother lost a baby when I was 8 years old, and I realized, and I didn't realize anything. I was 7 years old, 8 years old. But later on, I realized a lot of the way I think is because of that event, right? And then it really shaped who I became. Then my best friend died when I was 25. And that was another event that really shaped who I became. And I used it, after 2 years, I was able to rebuild myself and grow way more, right? So there's something about post-traumatic growth also.
Right.
And so it's to me, I know a lot of us are going to be faced with these situations. And Edith Eger and Viktor Frankl, they're all talking about that moment between the trigger and the reaction and the choice that we have in seeing ourselves as a survivor, as a victim. I think it's a battle.
The choice.
Yeah, the choice. Exactly.
Right.
She calls it the choice,
Right.
Edith. She says we have a choice. And so to me, it's always about that choice. And knowing, at that time, you asked me, why would I leave McKinsey? It was a choice. It was a choice that at that point in my life, it was the right thing to do. And, yeah.
And so we both are aware of the tremendous challenges that await us. And we don't even know what the future holds in terms of mental health. And like I just said, the challenges are great. But are you pessimistic, optimistic? How are you feeling about where we're going?
So there's a quote that really spoke to me, which is the pessimists read the news and the optimists read history books. And
explain.
Jewish
history books.
All history books. I mean, I that was very clear to me during the whole Reforma Mishpatit, right? Where a lot of people thought it was the end of Israel, the end of democracy.
Right. These are the struggles over the justice
exactly. So summer
reforms.
Summer of 2023, right before the war.
Right.
We're at the verge. We didn't think anything could be worse, right? And then the war starts, and at that time I said, look, we've overcome so much, guys. Like, look at a history book. Like, and we always come out stronger on the other end. And of course, not every day you feel that way. I mean, I myself struggle with that a lot. Like, I'm not naturally positive. I actually work on myself all the time. But I believe, though, that when you look at the cycle of history, we come out stronger, and that there is something about post-traumatic growth. And that
we didn't even talk about post-traumatic growth, but we could do a whole podcast just on that.
Exactly, and so I'm positive that in the end, we'll be better and even stronger, and I know a lot of people are talking about this as our second independent war, and maybe it will be a sovereign nation, a real sovereign nation after this. And, I think we have a generation of soldiers that we all thought, oh, this crazy, generation and the social media, and look at them, they're incredible. And so I think we have a lot, to be positive about.
Great. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end. I want to thank you so much. You're really just very inspirational, and not that I could be the representative of the people of the state of Israel, but if I were able to be the representative of the people of the state of Israel, I want to thank you for your very important work that you're doing. The founder and executive director of ICAR. Again, go to the website, ICAR, ICARcollective.org, one word, and just get involved in this work. And this may be the most critical challenge that the state of Israel is facing right now as we try to get out of this war. So we thank you for your work, and we look forward to further cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on Defining Moments. Remember to subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star rating and a review. Please share this podcast with your friends who, like you, want to be inspired both by this period in Jewish and Israeli history and by the people who are making these defining moments happen. Let's not squander this unique opportunity. Maybe the next defining moment will be created by you or me. Until next time, I'm Rabbi David Fine.